On the outskirts of a quiet American town, there was an old iron bridge that locals whispered about but never dared to cross after midnight. Rusted beams stretched over a narrow river that was almost always shrouded in fog, no matter the season. To most outsiders, it looked like just another forgotten relic of the past, a crumbling structure meant to be torn down years ago but somehow still standing. To the people who lived nearby, however, the bridge carried a far darker reputation, one built on stories of disappearances, strange lights, and screams echoing through the night. Jake and his friends didn't believe any of it. Teenagers full of adrenaline and arrogance, they laughed at the tales told in hushed tones at diners and gas stations. To them, it was just another piece of folklore designed to scare kids into staying home. On one cold October night, they piled into Jake's beat-up truck, determined to prove everyone wrong. With the windows down and music blaring, they drove out toward the bridge, the road growing quieter and darker with every passing mile. The further they went, the fewer streetlights lined the road, until the only illumination came from the dim glow of the truck's headlights cutting through the mist. The moment the bridge came into view, silence fell inside the vehicle. The iron beams stood like jagged bones in the fog, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the road. The truck slowed, the tires crunching against gravel as if even the machine hesitated to go further. Jake forced a laugh and nudged the gas pedal, but no one returned his chuckle. They rolled onto the bridge, the sound of the river beneath echoing strangely, as though the water carried whispers instead of rushing currents. Halfway across, the engine sputtered. The truck jerked violently, headlights flickering once, twice, then going completely dark. The music cut off. The only sound was the soft moan of the wind weaving through the beams above them. Everyone froze, eyes darting nervously at one another. Jake cursed under his breath and turned the key, but the ignition refused to catch. He tried again and again, each attempt echoing louder in the dead stillness. Then came the first sound, something faint, like footsteps. But they weren't on the bridge. They were underneath. Slow, dragging steps that seemed impossibly heavy for someone walking through water. The group held their breath as the sound grew louder, closer, as though whoever, or whatever, was beneath them was making its way toward the center of the bridge. Suddenly, a metallic bang rang out, like a hand slamming against the iron beams. One of the girls screamed, her voice cutting sharp through the night. Jake tried the ignition again, his hands shaking, but the truck remained lifeless. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the bridge. It wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. It just stood there, as though it had been waiting for them all along. The figure at the end of the bridge did not move. It was tall, impossibly still, its outline blurred by the rolling fog. At first, Jake thought it might just be a trick of the mist, a shadow cast by the beams or the trees beyond. But then, it shifted slightly, one step forward. The sound of that single step echoed across the bridge, hollow and deliberate, like the thud of boots on steel. Everyone inside the truck froze, their eyes wide and unblinking. Who is that?" whispered Claire from the back seat, her voice breaking. Nobody answered. Jake swallowed hard and turned the key again, desperate to spark life into the dead engine. The starter whined, coughed, but refused to catch. His hands were slick with sweat as he slammed his palm against the steering wheel. The headlights flickered briefly, just long enough for them to see that the figure was no longer at the end of the bridge. It was closer. Much closer. Panic erupted inside the truck. Mark, the loudest of their group, tried to mask his fear with bravado. "It's probably some lunatic messing with us," he said, fumbling for the door handle. "I'll scare him off." Before anyone could stop him, he shoved open the door and stepped out, his sneakers scraping against the iron grating of the bridge. His breath formed quick white clouds in the icy air as he called out into the fog. "Hey! You think this is funny?" Silence answered him. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence so thick it felt unnatural. Then came a sound, low and guttural, like a growl vibrating through the steel beneath their feet. Mark froze, the bravado draining from his face. He turned to climb back into the truck, but something shifted in the fog behind him. Claire screamed as a pale hand shot out of the mist and clamped down on Mark's shoulder. He let out a yell and stumbled backward, tearing himself free, but not before they all saw the hand clearly. It was thin, unnaturally long, the skin grayish and waterlogged, as though it had been soaking in the river for days. Mark scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door and locking it, his chest heaving. His eyes were wild. "It touched me," he gasped. "It wasn't God, it wasn't human." Jake's heart hammered as he tried the ignition again. This time, the engine roared to life, the headlights bursting back on and slicing through the fog. But what the light revealed made everyone wish it hadn't. Figures, dozens of them, were now standing along both sides of the bridge. Men, women, even children, all pale, dripping, their empty eyes fixed on the truck. Their clothes were torn, old-fashioned, like they belonged to another century. None of them moved, but their presence alone was suffocating. "Go!" Claire shrieked. "Just go!" Jake slammed the truck into gear, the tires screeching against the iron as he pressed down on the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, rattling across the bridge. The pale figures didn't move out of the way, instead, they seemed to fade into the fog as the headlights passed over them, only to reappear in the rearview mirror, still watching. As they neared the end of the bridge, a loud screech pierced the night. The sound was metallic and unbearable, like the entire structure was being torn apart. The truck shook violently, as if something beneath the bridge was trying to pull it down. Jake gritted his teeth and pressed harder, the end of the bridge finally in sight. Just as they reached solid ground, something slammed into the back of the truck with bone-crushing force, throwing everyone forward. The rear window cracked, shards raining onto the seats. Jake kept driving, refusing to look back, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Only when the bridge disappeared into the darkness behind them did the shaking stop. No one spoke. No one cried. They sat in silence, every one of them knowing that whatever haunted that bridge had followed them, and it wasn't finished yet. The road beyond the bridge stretched into empty farmland, but Jake didn't slow down until the truck had rattled through 2 more intersections and passed a boarded-up gas station. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror. The fog thinned behind them, but the weight of unseen eyes still pressed against the back of his skull. Finally, he pulled into an abandoned rest stop and cut the engine. For a long moment, no one moved. Their breaths came ragged, like they'd all been holding the air inside their lungs for too long. The silence in the truck was deafening, broken only when Claire's voice cracked. "We shouldn't have gone there. I told you, we shouldn't have gone." Mark rubbed his shoulder where the hand had grabbed him. His skin burned icy cold, and he kept rubbing as though he could scrub away the memory of its touch. "That wasn't just some creep," he muttered. "There were too many. And their eyes," he trailed off, his voice trembling. Jake shook his head as if trying to convince himself. "It was just people screwing with us. Locals, maybe. Old costumes, tricks with the lights. Bridges echo. That's all it was." But no one believed him, not even Jake. His words sounded hollow, and his hands still trembled on the wheel. They sat there in the dead rest stop, the flickering neon sign above the bathrooms casting sickly green light across the lot. The longer they sat, the colder the air seemed to get. Claire wrapped her arms around herself and leaned closer to the window, then froze. Her face went pale. "They followed us," she whispered. Everyone turned. At the far edge of the lot, just beyond the glow of the broken neon, stood the same figure they'd seen on the bridge. Tall, silent, featureless in the dark. And as the group stared in horror, more shapes began to emerge from the fog drifting across the asphalt. Slowly at first, then in clusters, until at least a dozen of the pale, dripping figures ringed the lot. Panic ripped through them. Jake turned the key, but the truck wouldn't start. The same nightmare again, the dead engine, the suffocating silence. He slammed his fist on the dashboard. No, no, no. The figures began to move forward, their bare feet dragging along the cracked pavement. Every step echoed with a wet squelch. Their mouths opened, but no words came out, just a low moaning sound, like wind pushing through hollow pipes. Claire screamed and shoved at the door, but it wouldn't unlock. Mark tried his, pulling so hard the handle snapped in his hand. The truck had become a prison. The moaning grew louder, shaking the air around them, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside their own skulls. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The figures stood frozen just outside the neon's reach, their heads all turning in unison toward the river in the distance. For a moment, none of the friends dared to breathe. Then came another sound, an ear-splitting crack, like steel tearing apart. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that sound. The bridge. One by one, the figures dissolved into the fog, vanishing as though they had never been there. The lot grew silent again, but the silence felt worse than the noise. The group sat frozen, the knowledge sinking deep in their bones, the bridge wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And whatever lived there wasn't going to let them go so easily. The neon buzzed overhead, sputtering like it was about to die, and for a moment the rest stop was plunged into total darkness. When the light flickered back on, the lot was empty again. No figures. No fog. Nothing but the rustling of dead leaves along the cracked pavement. Claire pressed her hands over her face, rocking slightly as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. Mark rubbed his shoulder again, harder this time, and Jake finally broke the silence. "We're leaving. I don't care if this truck has to roll on fumes, I'm not staying here." He twisted the key. The engine roared to life instantly, almost too easily, as though mocking the terror it had caused minutes ago. No one questioned it. They wanted out. Jake floored the gas, the truck skidding out of the lot and onto the road, tires screeching. But the night didn't let go of them. The fog thickened again as they drove, curling around the truck like skeletal fingers. Headlights struggled to cut through it. The road stretched on endlessly, and even though Jake had driven these back roads 100 times, nothing looked familiar anymore. It was as if the bridge had pulled them into another place altogether. Mark leaned forward, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We're not going the right way. I swear we've passed that same tree twice." Claire glanced back, her eyes widening. No, don't say that." But she was right to be afraid. Because in the rearview mirror, Jake saw something that froze his blood. Behind them, far back in the swirling mist, was the outline of the bridge. It shouldn't have been there. They'd left it miles behind. Yet somehow, no matter how far they drove, the bridge loomed in the distance, following them. The truck shuddered as a loud bang rattled its frame, like something had jumped onto the roof. Everyone screamed. Jake gripped the wheel and tried to swerve, but the sound of dragging metal scraped above them, moving slowly from the roof toward the hood. Claire ducked down, clutching her ears, while Mark fumbled to roll down the window and look up. What he saw made him choke on his words. A pale, bloated face pressed against the glass of the windshield from outside, its mouth too wide, its empty sockets dripping black water that streaked across the glass. It clung upside down like an insect, its skeletal fingers clawing at the edges of the hood. Jake floored the gas, swerving hard, trying to throw it off. The creature screeched, its nails sparking against the metal, before finally being flung into the fog. But as soon as it disappeared, another thud struck the side of the truck, then another, until the entire vehicle rocked violently as though surrounded. The headlights flickered. Shadows moved in the beams, dozens of them, running alongside the truck at impossible speeds, their limbs jerking unnaturally, like marionettes pulled by broken strings. Their faces pressed to the windows, watching silently, their mouths open in soundless screams. The road ahead split, and Jake veered blindly onto the left path. The figures thinned, their forms melting back into the fog, until at last the truck burst into open space. The fog cleared, and in the distance they saw lights, warm, glowing, human lights. A diner. Relief washed over them as Jake pulled into the lot, the hum of neon and the sight of parked cars bringing a fragile sense of safety. They piled out of the truck, breathless, shaking, clinging to the idea that they were finally free. But when they stepped inside the diner, every conversation stopped. Dozens of heads turned toward them. And in that moment, they realized something wasn't right. The customers stared too long. Their faces were pale. Their eyes were hollow. And dripping onto the black and white tile floor beneath them was water, dark, murky, river water. The door swung shut behind them with a heavy thud, cutting off the night. For a moment, the warmth of the diner's neon lights felt comforting. The jukebox in the corner hummed softly, and the smell of burnt coffee and fried food lingered in the air. But the silence that followed their entrance was unbearable. Every single person inside had turned to stare, their hollow eyes fixed on Jake and his friends. Claire grabbed Jake's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake tried to steady himself. It's just late. Maybe we look out of place." His words sounded weak, even to him. Mark, still clutching his shoulder, whispered, "Look at their feet." Jake's eyes darted downward. A chill spread through his chest. Every customer's shoes, or what should have been shoes, dripped with dark water that pooled on the floor. Some of them were barefoot, their toes pale and swollen like they'd been soaking in a river for days. The puddles spread slowly toward the booths and counter, yet no one seemed to notice. The waitress behind the counter smiled too widely, her lips stretching unnaturally thin. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice hollow, almost mechanical. Jake shook his head violently. "We're leaving." But when he turned toward the door, his stomach dropped. The glass panes no longer showed the lot or the truck outside. Instead, they looked out over black water, rippling endlessly in all directions. The bridge stood faintly in the distance, its skeletal beams rising from the fog. They hadn't escaped. They were still caught in its grip. Panic erupted. Claire bolted for the door, yanking it open, but instead of the lot, a wave of freezing river water surged inside. She screamed and stumbled back as the water receded, leaving the tiles slick and dripping. The customers remained still, their blank eyes following her every move. Jake pulled her close, his mind racing. "It's messing with us. None of this is real. It can't be." The jukebox flickered, the song warping into a distorted echo, the same moaning sound they'd heard on the bridge. One by one, the customers began to rise from their seats. They moved stiffly, jerking, water streaming from their clothes. Their mouths opened in unison, but instead of words, the sound of rushing river water poured out, deafening, unnatural. Mark grabbed a chair and swung it wildly as one of the pale figures reached for him. The chair shattered, but the figure didn't fall, it dissolved into mist, reforming just inches away. He screamed, swinging the broken leg like a weapon, but it passed straight through. The group backed toward the kitchen, slipping on the wet floor. Jake shoved open the swinging door, pulling Claire and Mark with him. The kitchen was empty, but the lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the counters. Pots clanged as though shaken by invisible hands. The sound of water dripping echoed from everywhere at once. "We have to wake up," Claire sobbed. "This isn't real. It's the bridge. It's pulling us in." Jake didn't know if she was right, but he knew one thing: if they stayed, they were dead. He spotted a back door and sprinted toward it, but when he yanked it open, icy fog poured in, revealing the iron beams of the bridge stretching into nothingness. No matter where they ran, it was always waiting. Behind them, the kitchen door swung open. Figures poured in, silent, dripping, their empty eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And in the center of them all stood the tall shadow they had first seen on the bridge, finally stepping forward, finally closing in. The tall figure moved into the kitchen, its steps deliberate, the steel floor groaning beneath its weight. Jake grabbed a knife from the counter and held it up, though his hands trembled so badly the blade quivered in the air. Claire clung to his arm, her breath ragged, while Mark pressed himself against the wall, his shoulder still throbbing with an inhuman cold.